Today, we're going to be talking about fetal growth following conception. Once a sperm and egg unite and whole process happens, there's about 40 weeks of development that usually takes place, and these weeks can be broken down into numerous ways. The first way is viability. A fetus born before 20 weeks is not viable. After 20 weeks, these babies born have a much higher chance of survival that goes up as time passes. The weeks can also be viewed as things called trimesters. So there are usually 3 different trimesters and they happen at different stages of development. This first trimester will generally happen between 0 to 13 weeks. So that would be the first trimester, and then the second trimester is going to happen at 26 weeks. It's going to be 13 to 26 weeks. And third is the final stage of development. And so starting out, the first thing that we notice is the heart starts to beat at about 28 days. And with this new heartbeat, the blood also begins to circulate the body. So following this, we can see other major things form, like the cranial nerves that eventually will innervate muscle fibers in the embryo. Following this development of the muscle fibers, we can see the heart split into 4 different chambers. And as the heart splits into these different chambers, we are also able to actually hear the heartbeat with a fetoscope. So if you listen closely enough, you could hear the circulation. So following that, the lung buds are going to be forming, and also the trachea will be forming, which will be essential later in life, obviously. Following that, we also have structures like ears and hands also form. They will also mature later in life. The liver of the embryo will form and start to produce red blood cells. So during the first trimester is where a lot of this organ development happens, and it's from week 3 to week 8. And these weeks are called the embryo phase. This phase is where embryos are very, very susceptible to teratogens, and teratogens can cause really bad birth defects. And since this is such a stage of growth of organ development for the fetus, it's really important to avoid those environmental hazards, things like drinking, smoking during pregnancy, because it could harm your baby. At about week 12, you're going to start being able to palpate the uterus. So this is a probable sign of pregnancy, but there's also going to be changes like bile is going to be able to be formed by the liver. So once we are getting to the end of the first trimester, you're going to see a lot of major structures becoming completely developed or starting to develop. But at week 16, you're going to be able to determine the sex of the baby, so the gender, female or male. And just before that, you're going to be able to see signs of pregnancy just showing in the stomach. So you're going to be able to see a baby bump on most women. So following that, at week 20, we're going to have fetal swallowing, which is really important for nutrients, and it's also important for the production of meconium. At about week 22, we see the development of brown fat, which is incredibly important for babies because babies are so bad at regulating their own temperature, and they need this fat to survive. Right before that, we're going to see the start of intestines forming, which will later mature in trimester 3, but it's really important to get that start. So we'll see later in the second trimester a very important thing, which is gas exchange from the lung buds that formed in the first trimester. Gas exchange is obviously incredibly important, and this is why most pregnancies are viable after 20 weeks. So during that same time, you can see insulin production, which is also incredibly important with that fetal viability. And we're also going to see the brain fully developed, which is also important. If you have a child born before then, they might have severe mental defects. So now as we enter the third trimester, the baby is capable of sight at just shy of 30 weeks. You can actually stimulate a fetus by putting a light on the mother's belly, and they usually get really agitated and move, which is just an indication that those body systems are developing properly. One of the most crucial points of the third trimester is surfactant production in the lungs. You need surfactant to survive outside of the uterus, and it's really important that we get those fetal lungs to mature enough to produce surfactant before they're born. A lot of times doctors will prescribe things like steroids to do this. So we'll see the intestines are fully formed just shy of 40 weeks, and we'll also see fetal movement from the second trimester to the third trimester, which is incredibly important for detecting fetal health. At about 32 weeks, we can use a test called the non-stress test, and it's to make sure that the fetal heart rate has enough cellular accelerations in order to assure us that the pregnancy is going well. So this is tested on a usually weekly basis, and if the mother is suffering from something like preeclampsia, it's tested a lot more frequently. So this entire stage after the organ development embryonic stage is called the fetal stage. The fetal stage is where just a lot of massive development happens, and it's really important to look out for these signs. The placenta provides a lot of nutrients to the fetus, and that formation really starts at about 5 weeks, and it's fully matured at week 20. So at about week 11, it's going to be able to start producing its own hormones. The mother doesn't have to really keep up with it. So these hormones are progesterone and estrogen, and they just sustain the pregnancy and make sure that the baby is developing properly. Now this will go on until all the way to term when the baby is actually born. It's really important to know all of these stages, because knowing these stages and knowing the things that develop during them will help you detect a healthy baby. And you need to be able to detect whether a baby is growing properly. Now, when talking about fetal development, it's really important to understand how the fetus develops. The fetus will be inside of an amniotic sac that has an umbilical cord attached to the placenta. Now, the umbilical cord has 2 arteries and 1 vein. The vein is actually oxygenated, and the 2 arteries are deoxygenated blood. They provide everything that the fetus needs to survive. And also, inside, this is called the amniotic fluid. It provides nutrients and also provides a lot of support for the growing baby. Inside with the arteries and the veins, you have this thing called Wharton's jelly, which stops compression of them and helps proper blood flow. Eventually, you're going to see that when a baby is born at term, they usually have 70 or 700 to 1,000 milliliters of amniotic fluid. Now, sometimes a baby can be born with more fluid, like over 2,000 milliliters, which is polyhydramnios, and then if it's under about 300, it's going to be oleohydramnios. Now, having more fluid or not enough fluid can be really bad and cause birth defects and signs and symptoms that are just related to improper fetal growth.